Thanks everybody who came. This is super cool. Not everybody realizes how important this topic really is. So this is actually a 40-minute talk that I'm condensing into 15 minutes. So let's just kind of get into it. So yeah, it's ditch toxic systems so we can finally love video game romance. My name is Elie Abraham, and if you're not already familiar with me, I'm known for a lot of things in games. I do a lot of music and audio in games. I'm also a writer. I'm currently working on the DLC for a game called Dandara that came out for the Switch last year. But this game is about trends that we experience in some of our games, so let's do it. Where's the clicker? All right, let's do it. Content warning, just letting you know, there are some, I'm going to be describing a lot of things that I think are damaging and unethical in games, and I'm going to have depictions of things that I think are unethical, that have previously been glorified, including screenshots. So I welcome you to leave if that sounds triggering or anything for you. Cool? Cool. Let's do it. So let's start with a confession. I'm a sucker for romance in games. I don't know if everybody else here is like, yep, I do the optional romance every single time. But I am super that person. You know, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, Stardew Valley, all of these kinds of games. If there's an optional romance, I am in on it. But 9 out of 10 times, they're super disappointing. They're absolutely terrible. They're extremely disappointing. But I feel that romance is something we value a lot in society in general. Not because it should be prioritized in the way that it is, but it's just something that we see valued and constantly thrown into many different kinds of media, et cetera, and it's something I explore deeply in my personal life, so of course I want it in my games. Yet romance in games rarely ever actually speaks to me. In general, it's often fan service and wish fulfillment, as you can see, and of course often in a very sexualized way. This is the cover of Catherine, which, by the way, is an incredible puzzle game. They gave Edie in Mass Effect 3 camel toe. I know. It's disgusting. And so fan service and wish fulfillment might be enjoyable because we're literally having our fantasies and our dreams catered to. But how frequently does one's fantasies actually represent reality? And how frequently is one's fantasies even possible in reality? And maybe you're hearing this question and you're thinking like, well, who cares? Why does it matter? Why is that even a problem? And I'll tell you why that's a problem. And that's because the values of our society are obviously represented in our media. And when you know, I'm not going to say that every single movie, every single game, every single book is a representation of our values in media. But when you see trends across media, then that is a representation of what our values are. And it's what we teach people we are trying to maintain. And if this is what you're seeing, that's a problem. So when we create a medium that is designed to encompass wish fulfillment, we are participating actively in a system that fosters the feeling of entitlement. And that's another like one of these like buzzwords or whatever. And it is dangerous, and I'm going to talk about that here. And it's particularly dangerous when it comes to romance. So before I continue, like I'm just making it painfully clear, like I said, not every single thing you see in a game or a book or a movie is like, these are the values of society. But the trends are something. And an example of a trend that I know we all familiar with is, for example, let's go back to our childhood, Disney films, princes and princesses. We've seen this over and over and over again, where the storyline requires the prince to save the princess, and she always fell in love with him in the end, for some reason. And I loved many of those movies, but as a society, we started to speak up against this trend. There was a lot of things we saw problematic with this, and we can tell that we started to speak up against this because it started to represent itself in our media. Think about how there's this trope of like, you know, the princess who kisses the frog, et cetera, and now we made a movie that literally takes that storyline and turns it upside down. And it wasn't just this one film. Here in Frozen, we're seeing that the prince was actually the bad guy in the end of the film. And the actual love was the bond between the two sisters. And obviously, the talk is short, and I want to focus on video games, so I'll jump out of this. So, as I said, I'm a sucker for romance in games, but it rarely ever actually speaks to me. So I find myself disappointed all the time when I'm playing games that have optional romances. In fact, the stories that I have found the most compelling were often tragic or barely spoken, which I'll come back to. But first, let's consider why romance in video games is often so much of a letdown. And for starters, it feels like the narrative in video games in general, especially dialogue, is only recently starting to get good. Recently being like, I don't know, the past decade, so maybe I'm dating myself. But when you look at old school RPGs from the Super Nintendo of our childhood, none of those dialogues are actually good. The best you can hope for is something that's just like devoid of cliches, like something that you haven't seen over and over and over again. In other games, and obviously video games have suffered a lot of this comparison of being like, well, movies tell it better, books tell it better, etc., etc. And if you look at games like, I don't know, one of my favorite JRPGs from my childhood is like Chrono Trigger. I'm like, yeah, those games are fun. The dialogue sucks, you know? It's because we didn't have writers making those games. So now, though, there are tons of games that we think are very well written, and we realize they can relay very compelling and moving narratives, but romance seems to seriously still be lacking. It's incredibly lackluster. Some of the examples here are actually examples of games that did it well. But it isn't exclusive to games, like not at all. Obviously, this came way before games. Society right now is like practically warring over how gender roles are depicted in movies, how romance is depicted in movies, and we're seeing that represent itself in call-out culture, in efforts to understanding, defining, and explaining consent. And suddenly, like our action heroes from 80s and 90s movies don't seem so irresistibly sexy. In fact, they seem kind of privileged and creepy. And I'm pointing fingers at like James Bond on top of Pussy Galore in Goldfinger, or Indiana Jones literally whipping Willie in and reeling her in that way. She's storming away from him in this scene because she's angry with him. Don't worry, I've got my handy whip, which I use to reel in women. And so you want to know why that's a problem? It's a problem because I loved those movies growing up. I loved James Bond. I loved Indiana Jones. And now I look at them retrospectively and I'm like, huh. So some heroes from my childhood were doing things that I now see are immoral. And that's also what we're seeing happening in video games right now. So in a society where we haven't been teaching the truthful nature of these happenings, in fact, oftentimes we really disguise it. Like you see scenes like this, there's pretty music in the background going like la da 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 da, you know, or whatever. If there was some more aggressive or violent music taking place, we'd be like, whoa, why is Indy doing all this? But we literally try to give it this feeling like, no, we like this. Listen to the pretty music. This is good. This is a cute thing. This is a kind gesture. This is a loving thing. And that's part of how we enforce these toxic behaviors. And obviously we're getting to how we see that in systems and games. So this is misguiding the consumer. Us. It is affecting us. It changes how we think. It changes what we think is out there in society. These are the models and the examples that we have of how, you know, like when you're growing up, what are your models for romance? It's what you see in media and then, like, I don't know, your parents or something. And so obviously years later, we see this stuff. It's extremely disenchanting, and it's very disappointing, and it's upsetting. And I'm not saying that we have to stop loving like James Bond and Indiana Jones. I still love these things, but especially if we're going to keep appreciating stuff from the past, we have to admit that we realize we're seeing it through a different lens now, and we realize the ways in which we can evolve and move forward. And just acknowledge that this was problematic, and that doesn't mean that we have to just completely junk it, throw it in the garbage. We just need to talk about it. And one of those things we need to talk about is how there was a trend where a lot of these films were mostly just catering to male fantasies. And that's what I showed you in, like, with the cover for Catherine, with the fact that Edie had camel toe. There were no effing women who were going like, well, this robot needs camel toe. Nobody said that. Nobody said, well, apparently some dude in the studio did. But anyway, more importantly, dun dun dun, we have to do better. Going forward, we have to do better. So here's another princess story we've all heard before, and some points we need to make about it. Dun, dun, dun. I am so over the damsel in distress trope. I am so over it. I don't care which castle the princess is in. I want to know why she was made to be so fragile and in need of Super Mario and required to fall in love with him at the end as a reward. Like, why are we so convinced that being saved would mean that we'd fall in love with someone? Like, which one of you has had a fantasy about a chubby Italian plumber kicking down the door and go, "It's-a me, you are free," and he goes, "Oh my God, this is everything I wanted in a romantic life partner." But that's literally what we're showing here. And And so if we're looking for change, then who are we looking to help make it happen? Where are our models? Because what we have right now is super not cutting it. The most recent Super Marios, even though the games are getting so much better, still go off the damsel in distress trope. What is that? Why are we seeing that? I mean, shared trauma, for example, can be a bonding thing, but no one's going to be like, that's it, we're in love now. And so maybe my nose up in the air skepticism might be a bit of an overreaction, but you have to realize that for me, when I was growing up, like games like Final Fantasy X had the romance with like Tidus and Yuna, and people were thinking like, oh, this is it, this is a good romance, this is so beautiful. But if you think about this romance in this game, it is very like Romeo and Juliet-esque. They're super not fit for each other. It gets really like crazy and it's grandiose. It's like this big Hollywood thing that we've seen over and over again, and we recognize it. But whose experience does this actually speak to? Like, which one of you fell in love with the person you're in love with because she went on a pilgrimage to sacrifice herself to prevent, like, a beast coming to take over the world? Just me? Like, and so these romances, they're very iconic. We recognize them as a thing we see in media over and over and over again. But they don't actually, and what I'm saying now is like, you know what? Maybe, hear me out, guys, just maybe we just want romances that speak to our actual experiences with romance. We don't just have unrealistic ideas of love. The thing is that video games are often driven by wish fulfillment. It's just like what I said about fan service with the pictures I was showing earlier, for example. But they do this to like a toxic degree. And oftentimes, sex is the expected reward in video games. You follow through with the specific quests, you're merely accumulating enough points, or however it's graphically or numerically measured, your relationship with someone, and then at the end, you have sex. There's the sex cutscene, or they move into your house and never talk to you again. And we literally allow players to continue living in game worlds where we keep up this notion that these are valid expectations to have in romantic relationships. It's no wonder people feel entitled. How do these systems often work? With kindness tokens. And I'd like to explain kindness tokens to you in a way that might feel familiar. 3 steps for sleeping with anyone, and you'll never guess how easy they are. Step 1. Agree with all of their opinions, or they will like you less, and you will see the numbers go down. Which is crazy, because how can you ever learn about another person like that? Like, anybody, like some of our most rewarding and fulfilling and fruitful friendships and romantic relationships are the ones where they changed how you think. Why would you have a romantic system that literally rewards you for just saying yes to anything they say? Step 2, give them gifts. They don't care how many monsters you had to slay. They just want those diamonds. 3, do their side quest. Nothing shows how much you love them than traveling to the other side of the galaxy to find their long-lost father. And it's amazing. It's like, so how did you two get together? Well, I flew across the galaxy. I found her long-lost father, and then she had sex with me. And sex always comes at the end. It's the reward we are all eagerly expecting. In Mass Effect 2, there's a powerful biotic named Jack who joins your crew and is one of the available romance options. Now, you have the option to have sex with her versus later in the game, and if you do, she will stop talking to you. Now, some people will be like, oh, but Yeoman Kelly tells you that if you have sex with her, she's not going to respect you. That's another thing I want to ask about. Why are we glorifying chastity? Why is that a thing that's happening? I've had so many people tell me, like, horror stories about their sexual education where they're like, my teacher came in with a rose and pulled off a petal and said, every time you sleep with someone, it's like pulling off a petal from this rose. And nobody wants a naked rose. But that is literally what we are putting into video games. You sleep with her, she will stop speaking to you. Nobody wants a naked rose. Because of course, like I said, sex comes at the end. That's just the end of the relationship. So you may not realize, but that is an unintended narrative you have now put in your game. We are glorifying the idea of chastity because the kindness tokens models always leads to the reward of sex and marriage. And since it's the only thing they have to reward us with, sex literally has to be worked for. It has to be earned. It has to be achieved. In the same game, you can attempt to romance Samara, who tells you, I can't be with you. She says she cannot be with you because she's like a space-age samurai who follows an honor code, but you can try anyway. And if you do, you nearly share a kiss, and then she's like, Shepard, I can't. And then she'll stop speaking to you. The moment you realize she's not going to marry you and move into your room, the moment you realize she's not going to sleep with you, it's over. Which is incredible, because this would have been an amazing opportunity to talk about heartbreak, to show a tale of romance where these two people desperately wanted to be together, but it affected the sci-fi mission and yada, yada, yada. These are all these things I would have wanted to see, especially because most of us can relate to the idea of having our heart broken. That's a thing we feel for. That would have been such a compelling narrative. But they were just like, but she won't sleep with you. I guess we don't need to pay the writers anymore. A dangerous system, both in games and in your real-world relationships, is one where sex is the reward. Now I already said that. And you know, it's funny, a lot of people are thinking, especially because games are so driven by wish fulfillment, they're like, well, players aren't going to want a game with heartbreak. Actually, you know what? I want games that move me. I want games that are compelling. I want games with narratives that speak to my actual experiences. And I have had my heart broken. I'm certain that most of us in this room have had our heart broken. And it might require a little tragedy to pull that off in our games. In Stardew Valley, you can literally give any romanceable option a diamond or a cake or a bottle of wine twice a week from the moment you meet them and never otherwise speak to them, and they will marry you in the end. You can literally just like show up, just, here's your diamond. You do that twice a week, and at the end, you can also have 2 kids. So I loved this game, but bluntly, kindness token systems disgust me. We teach players that you literally put in coins of kindness and gifts and so on and so forth. Sex and marriage comes out. Your progress may even be marked, for example, like in Stardew Valley, with these little hearts. They even say, only 2 gifts a week, because 3 is just too creepy. Chill out, buddy. It's the first week. They don't want more than 2 diamonds. Here, a sliding scale a la Dragon Age. You can literally say, plus 19 still counts as neutral. They tell you that. And it says right there, party members' approval changes based on plot decisions or gifts. High approval provides possible romance options. So I just make plot decisions they approve of, and they give them gifts, and they'll sleep with me. So there's no emotional growth in this completely empty exchange. Plus, like I said, in the end, it's all about the sex of the marriage. But it's funny that they'll just move into your house and then they'll never talk to you again. Because isn't that the part of the relationship that's interesting when you actually start dating each other? And this is the place where games just cut off relationships. They're like, that's it, it's over. And it would have been amazing if systems have been like, oh, these two, the playable character and the NPC are now romantically involved. Let's have that affect the missions. Let's have them come up to you at one point being like, hey, can we quit trying to save the world for just 5 minutes? Just come do something with me, you know? And some people are thinking like, oh, but we you know how many people we'd have to hire to write a system like that? Oh my God. It's like writing compelling narratives requires actual writers. Who would have thought that you need people who have actually had these experiences, who are compelling writers, to make them believable? And it's amazing that like they're all FAQable. You can just like Google Jack romance. That's it. But in the real world, this is what you look like when you go on a date. You're powdering your nose, you're tying up your tie, the whole thing. You're just like, oh my God, I sent too many Y's when I said, hey, I sent the wrong emoji. They think I'm being too flirty. You're like feeling nervous, and video games never give you that. They never ever give you that. But we're feeling terrified to having put ourselves out there, and video games rob you of being able to feel that. And romances in games should just kind of encourage the values that we want to see in our romances in the real world. And so some people might be thinking like, well, isn't being kind and giving gifts like a good example? But I'm not against kindness, but that is transactional at best in video games, and led by the expectation of sex and marriage at the end of the game. The first Witcher makes it collectible. Every person you sleep with gives you one of these erotic cards. So you're telling me nobody in Stardew Valley just wants a mixtape? They don't want a diamond, they just want a mixtape? They just want to bake with me? Maybe they don't like gifts at all? You can give Elie Camelto, you can have that stupid card system from The Witcher, but you can't write a more compelling narrative system in games? Hire me and I will. It's also weird that romanceable characters never romance each other, like in the real world. And I've once ever seen this in games. In Mass Effect 3, Shepard can walk into a room, Tali and Garrus are there, they go, oh, Shepard, and he goes, I'm happy for you. That is the only time I have ever seen it in games. But don't you want to see these relationships that you worked for? You know, because remember, relationships in the real world, they're not exclusively about you. That's why I want to see characters romance each other. You want games romances in games not to feel achieved. You want to see them developed into something mutual, like actual relationships in the real world. That's when they're rewarding and fruitful. And obviously I don't have much time, so real quickly I'm just going to wrap up. I have 0 time. Does anybody, who wants to hear the rest of my talk? Who wants to ask me a question? Can I use my question time to wrap up with the last couple slides?
You used your question.
I used my question time. I used everything. I told you it was a 40-minute talk, right? I guess you got the idea. All I wanted to do. You come to me afterwards if you want to hear some of my examples of things that were seen in games that were good examples of things we should explore in games in romances. But you just got the critique part. Sorry you don't get to see my last 5 slides. My name's Elie Abraham. Thank you.